At 1 a.m., my daughter-in-law sent 15 vicious texts, threatening to cut me out of my son's life and ensure my grandchildren would never know me. For years, she'd poisoned their minds. I simply replied, "Okay, Serafina." What she didn't know was I'd been preparing for this moment. This is my story. Like, share, and tell me where you're listening from. The harsh glow of her phone shattered the peaceful quiet of Eleanor's bedroom, pulling her abruptly from a shallow sleep. The insistent buzzing wasn't a one-off notification. It was a furious barrage vibrating against the bedside table with increasing urgency. Disoriented, Eleanor reached for the device, her 63-year-old eyes blinking against the sudden brightness. It was past 1 in the morning. Who could possibly be texting her at this ungodly hour? A name flashed across the screen, one that had brought a knot of dread to her stomach for nearly a decade. Serafina, her daughter-in-law. The messages, numbering 15 in quick succession, began to scroll, each one a tiny dagger dipped in venom. "You selfish, ungrateful old woman," the first read, blunt and unforgiving. Eleanor winced, a familiar ache settling in her chest. More followed, each more cutting than the last. Serafina accused her of being a drain, a burden, a parasite on her son's life. The text escalated from insults to outright threats. "I will make sure Michael cuts you out of his will," one declared, as if her son's legacy was solely Serafina's to control. "You'll be left with nothing, just like you deserve." Eleanor felt a cold shiver trace its way down her spine as she read the final message. It wasn't just about money or even Michael's will. This one aimed directly for her heart, for the very essence of her existence. "Tomorrow you won't have anything left. The kids will never know their grandmother existed." The words hung in the digital air, a chilling pronouncement. Her grandchildren, Chloe and Liam, erased from her life as if she were a ghost already. This wasn't merely a threat. It was a declaration of war, a complete annihilation of her role in their family. Eleanor sank back against her pillows, the phone still clutched in her hand, its screen a hateful beacon in the dark. 8 years. 8 long years she had walked on eggshells, tiptoeing around Serafina's volatile moods, enduring her constant criticisms, and watching her son, Michael, drift further and further away. Once he had been her anchor, her proudest achievement. Now he was a shadow, muted and distant, seemingly helpless under Serafina's pervasive influence. He rarely called, and visits were always strained, shadowed by Serafina's watchful, critical gaze. Her thoughts drifted to Chloe, 7 years old with bright, curious eyes, and Liam, a boisterous 5-year-old whose laughter could light up a room. They were her sunshine, her reason for getting up each morning. But even their innocent joy had been tainted by Serafina. Eleanor remembered the sting of hearing Chloe innocently ask, "Grandma, why do Mommy and Daddy say your parents are our real grandparents?" It was a carefully planted seed, watered by constant comparison, nurtured by Serafina's insidious campaign to delegitimize Eleanor's place in their lives. Visits became less frequent. Phone calls were often cut short, always with Serafina's voice chirping, "Oh, they're busy, Eleanor. We'll call you back." A call that rarely came. A deep sigh escaped Eleanor's lips. She remembered the decades she had devoted to Michael. After her husband died young, leaving her a widow in her 30s, Eleanor had worked 2 jobs for 30 years straight, teaching during the day, waitressing, or bookkeeping in the evenings. She scrimped, she saved, she sacrificed. She never bought herself anything extravagant, always ensuring Michael had the best education, the best opportunities. She had poured every ounce of her energy, every penny of her earnings, into raising him. She had never asked for anything in return, only his happiness, and later a loving connection with his family. To be branded selfish and ungrateful now, by the very woman who benefited from her son's comfortable life, was a grotesque distortion of reality. But tonight, something shifted within Eleanor. The familiar ache of pain and resignation was replaced by a strange, resolute calm. She had been pushed too far, threatened with the loss of the only things that truly mattered. There was no more fear, only a quiet, steely resolve. Slowly, deliberately, Eleanor raised her phone again. Her fingers, steady despite the tremor in her heart, typed 2 simple words. "Okay, Serafina." No exclamation point, no question mark, no hint of emotion. Just a stark, unequivocal acceptance. It was not surrender. It was a promise. She slid out of bed, her movements quiet and purposeful. The soft carpet muffled her steps as she walked into the living room, the moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows. Her gaze settled on the large, antique mahogany armoire that stood proudly against the far wall, a piece inherited from her grandmother, rich with history and secrets. With surprising strength for her age, Eleanor pushed the heavy piece of furniture away from the wall, revealing a section of paneling that looked slightly different. She pressed a hidden catch, and a small, perfectly concealed safe clicked open. Inside, bathed in the dim light of her phone, was not merely a collection of sentimental trinkets, but a carefully curated trove. There were crisp financial documents, neatly bundled property deeds for several rental units she owned, and thick investment portfolios, their pages detailing decades of shrewd, disciplined growth. Serafina, in her grasping greed, had always assumed Eleanor was just an old widow living off a modest pension and her son's occasional charity. She had no idea of Eleanor's true wealth, painstakingly accumulated and carefully hidden. But more importantly, nestled amongst the financial papers were years of small, discreetly labeled audio recordings, little USB drives and micro SD cards, each containing countless hours of Serafina's manipulative conversations. Recordings of Serafina badmouthing Eleanor to Michael, subtly coercing him, openly discussing how to handle the old woman, even snippets of Serafina instructing the children to ignore Eleanor's calls. Eleanor also found a slim folder containing carefully cataloged screenshots. Screenshots of Serafina's texts to Michael, her emails to family friends, even public social media posts, all crafting a false narrative. They painted Eleanor as a demanding, senile elder, a constant burden, twisting every innocuous request or concerned question into a testament to her supposed selfishness. Eleanor had endured the whispers, the subtle coldness from acquaintances, the slow erosion of her reputation. But she hadn't just endured, she had documented. From a separate compartment within the safe, she retrieved a sealed envelope, thick and official-looking. It bore the letterhead of a prominent law firm and her attorney's elegant handwriting. These were documents drawn up 6 months ago after a particularly cruel incident. Serafina had been circling for a while, Eleanor realized, her hunger for control and wealth growing more voracious. Eleanor recalled Serafina's sudden, keen interest in estate planning during a recent family dinner, a conversation Eleanor had dismissed as merely a topic Michael had brought up. Serafina must have overheard something, assumed Eleanor was about to be cut out, or perhaps, in her warped reality, that Eleanor's meager assets were finally ripe for the picking. She had vastly underestimated Eleanor's quiet power, her resilience, and her meticulous preparation. The memory that had driven Eleanor to this point resurfaced with painful clarity. It was 6 months ago, almost to the day. Chloe had fallen off her bike, scraping her knee badly. Instinctively, she had called Eleanor, sobbing. But Serafina had snatched the phone, whispering angrily, "She's fine, Eleanor. Stop meddling. You're just upsetting her more," before hanging up. Eleanor had been left helpless, her heart aching for her granddaughter. That was the moment. The moment Eleanor understood that merely protecting herself wasn't enough. She had to fight for Chloe and Liam, for their right to know their grandmother, for their emotional well-being against Serafina's toxic influence. That day, she had contacted her attorney, and the careful, silent collection of evidence had truly begun. A new day was dawning, the first faint hint of gray seeping through her curtains. Eleanor knew a storm was coming, a maelstrom of Serafina's making. But she was no longer the woman who would sacrifice her dignity, her legacy, or her grandchildren for a semblance of peace. She was ready. The morning sun, usually a cheerful companion, now felt like a stark spotlight, illuminating the formidable stack of evidence Eleanor had gathered. After a restless night, she sat at her kitchen table, a mug of lukewarm tea forgotten beside her, meticulously reviewing the contents of her Serafina folder. Each document, each recording, each screenshot was a painful fragment of a carefully orchestrated campaign, a slow-burn manipulation that had chipped away at her family, her son, and her very identity. The earliest recording in her collection dated back to just 18 months after Michael and Serafina's wedding. Eleanor pressed play, and Serafina's voice, sugar-coated yet dripping with subtle disdain, filled the quiet kitchen. Honestly, Michael, your mother is just so needy, Serafina sighed dramatically on the recording. She calls twice a week, darling. Twice, it's just too much. I feel like she's hovering, constantly needing attention. Eleanor closed her eyes, a wave of familiar hurt washing over her. Twice a week, that was her normal check-in with her only son, a frequency that felt perfectly natural for a mother who had devoted her entire life to him. Her calls, born of love and genuine concern, had been twisted, reframed into an oppressive burden, a symptom of her alleged neediness. Even then, Michael's response on the recording was a weak, "She just means well, honey," followed by a sigh that hinted at his own quiet capitulation. 6 months later, another recording played, revealing a further tightening of Serafina's grip. This time, the fabricated offense was minor, almost comically so. "Michael, we really need to set some boundaries with your mother," Serafina declared, her voice firmer now, laced with a new edge of authority. "She just showed up today with a book for Chloe, without even asking. It's undermining my authority as a mother." Eleanor remembered that day vividly. She had found a pristine copy of Charlotte's Web at a local bookstore, the very edition she had read to Michael countless times as a boy, a story that had sparked his early love for reading. She had simply wanted to share that magic with her granddaughter, a small, thoughtful gesture of love. But Serafina had somehow managed to turn a beloved classic into an act of aggression, a deliberate transgression against her supposed parental dominion. Michael on the recording had sounded even more resigned. "Okay, Serafina, I'll talk to her." But he never had. Instead, the calls dwindled further. The turning point, the moment Eleanor truly began to understand the depth of Serafina's machinations, occurred at Chloe's 4th birthday party. The house had been buzzing with children's laughter and the clatter of excited parents. Eleanor, feeling a familiar pang of being on the periphery, had excused herself to the hallway, needing a moment of quiet. As she passed Chloe's bedroom, she noticed the door was ajar and voices drifted out. Serafina's, clear and cutting, and her own mother's, soothing and complicit. "Honestly, Mom, I just can't stand her," Serafina complained, her voice tight with resentment. "Michael's mother, I mean. She's so awkward, always hovering, and her gifts, another homemade sweater for Chloe's 4th birthday, it's just so cheap, it's embarrassing." Eleanor's heart had constricted. She had poured hours of love into that sweater, knitting it with the softest yarn, imagining Chloe's delight. Homemade gifts were her tradition, a way to offer something unique and from the heart, especially when her own means were modest compared to Serafina's affluent family. To hear it dismissed as cheap and embarrassing felt like a direct assault on her love. Serafina's mother, a woman Eleanor had always found outwardly charming but inwardly cold, offered her advice. "Well, darling, you know what to do. Just limit contact. Focus on your immediate family, your own parents. You don't need that kind of negativity in your life." Then came the chilling revelation, Serafina's voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Exactly. I'm going to make Michael see that we need to prioritize our immediate family. He just doesn't understand how draining she is." That night, Eleanor didn't sleep. The conversation replayed in her mind, a venomous echo. It was a conscious, calculated plan to erase her. The next morning, with a heavy heart and a new sense of purpose, she went to an electronics store and purchased a small, high-quality digital recording device. She told herself it was temporary, just a precaution, a way to understand what was really happening. She hoped she wouldn't need it for long, but she did. Over the following months, Serafina's manipulation became an art form. She was a master at rewriting history, twisting innocuous events into grievances. If Eleanor mentioned a concern, it was immediately reframed as parenting advice or criticism. If she asked about the children, Serafina would feign concern for Eleanor, saying, "Oh, you must be so tired, Eleanor, always worrying." It was a subtle, insidious campaign, designed to make Michael see his mother as a source of stress, a burden rather than a blessing. The children, too, became unwitting pawns. Whenever Eleanor offered to babysit or suggested an outing, Serafina would already have plans. "Oh no, they're going to my parents this weekend. They love the pool, you know." Serafina's parents, affluent and always eager to display their generosity, became the real grandparents, showering Chloe and Liam with expensive toys, exotic trips, and the allure of a sprawling house with a sparkling swimming pool. Eleanor's quiet visits, her handmade crafts, her stories, faded in comparison, overshadowed by the glitter of wealth. The most damaging recording, the one that solidified Eleanor's resolve to fight back, came from last Christmas. She had arrived at Michael and Serafina's house, a plate of her famous homemade pies in hand, ready for a festive gathering. The front door was ajar, and as she stepped in, she overheard Serafina on a family video call, her voice projecting with exaggerated weariness. "Oh, it's just been so much, Mom," Serafina was saying, oblivious to Eleanor's arrival. "Eleanor just got here with her usual homemade pies, bless her heart, and she's already giving me parenting advice." She saw Chloe playing on her tablet and immediately launched into a lecture about screen time, as if I don't know what I'm doing. Eleanor froze, the pies suddenly heavy in her hands. She hadn't lectured. She had simply noticed Chloe engrossed in a game and gently suggested, "Maybe we could read a story after dinner, sweetie." It was an innocent observation, a hopeful invitation, yet Serafina had expertly spun it into a harsh criticism, a public complaint painting Eleanor as an overbearing, judgmental mother-in-law to her own family. The rage, cold and steady, that had settled in Eleanor that Christmas had never truly left her. It had simmered, fueling her quiet collection of evidence, strengthening her resolve. She was not just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for the truth, for her son's clouded perception, and for her grandchildren's right to know the grandmother Serafina was trying to erase. Eleanor, still holding her homemade pies, had retreated into the quiet solace of the hallway, listening as Serafina continued her tirade on the video call. Now, new voices joined the conversation. Serafina's aunt, a sharp-tongued woman named Penelope, and her father, who rarely minced words. "You need to nip that in the bud, Serafina," Penelope advised, her voice firm and uncompromising. "Don't let her run roughshod over you. Michael needs to see who's really important." Serafina's father, a formidable man with a booming voice, chimed in. "Penelope's right. You need to document every single instance of her inappropriate behavior, Serafina. Keep a record. You never know when you might need it." A smug, self-satisfied smile stretched across Serafina's face on the screen, oblivious to Eleanor's presence just feet away. "Already ahead of you, Dad," she chirped, her tone oozing with pride. "I've been keeping a meticulous record of every time she oversteps, just in case. She thinks she's so clever, but I'm always one step ahead." Eleanor felt a cold dread settle deep in her stomach. It wasn't just about distancing her anymore. It wasn't just about limiting contact. Serafina was building a case, a dossier of manufactured slights and twisted narratives, all designed to sever Eleanor completely from Michael and the grandchildren. The realization was stark, brutal, and undeniable. Serafina wasn't just subtly undermining her. She was preparing for a complete excision. The bitter irony of the situation wasn't lost on Eleanor. Serafina was diligently documenting Eleanor's transgressions, her loving concern, her homemade gifts, her innocent observations. Meanwhile, Eleanor, unseen and unheard, was meticulously recording Serafina's actual manipulations, her calculated deceit, her insidious campaign of alienation. They were both building cases, but one was founded on lies and the other on cold, hard truth. Over the next 2 years, the pattern solidified into an unbearable routine. Invitations to family events came with unspoken or sometimes overtly stated conditions. "Please don't mention politics, Eleanor," or "Try not to spoil the children. We're trying to teach them moderation." Every interaction was scrutinized, every word Eleanor uttered dissected and twisted. Her attempts to connect, her genuine affection, were met with a wall of defensiveness and passive-aggressive remarks. Serafina became a gatekeeper, filtering all access to Michael and the children, meticulously controlling the narrative. Eleanor endured, her heart aching with each new slight, each fresh wave of isolation. She continued to record, to document, clinging to the naive hope that eventually Michael would see through Serafina's carefully constructed facade, that the son she had raised with such love and dedication would eventually recognize the truth and come back to her. Serafina's midnight messages, however, had brutally shattered that illusion. They proved unequivocally that Serafina intended to eliminate her entirely, to wipe her from the family's history, leaving no trace. There would be no eventual revelation for Michael if Eleanor allowed herself to be erased. As these thoughts swirled, her phone, which lay on the kitchen counter beside the evidence folder, suddenly chimed. Michael. His name flashed across the screen, a beacon signaling that the real battle, the one she had quietly prepared for, was finally about to begin. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and answered. Mom? Michael's voice was strained, unfamiliar, almost rehearsed. Good morning, Serafina and I. We were hoping you could come over this afternoon. We need to have an honest conversation about family expectations, about boundaries. His words, precise and devoid of genuine warmth, echoed the language Serafina often used. It was clear he was coached, delivering a script, but instead of a sadness, Eleanor felt a strange surge of relief. The waiting was over. The game was afoot. Of course, darling, Eleanor replied, keeping her voice light, almost cheerful. What time is good for you? 2:00, Michael said quickly, as if eager to get the appointment confirmed. Does that work? Perfectly, Eleanor affirmed. I'll see you then. She hung up, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. She had hours to prepare. She spent the remainder of the morning meticulously organizing her evidence. She created distinct files. Financial contributions to Michael and Serafina, Serafina's manipulative conversations, audio, text and email evidence of alienation, and documented instances of Michael's distance. Each recording was labeled, each screenshot annotated. She even included a copy of the legal documents drawn up by her attorney, the ones regarding her actual estate, which Serafina believed she had stumbled upon a secret about. Eleanor wanted to be ready, not just to defend herself, but to launch her own counteroffensive. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Eleanor pulled up to the familiar suburban house. It was a beautiful home, nestled on a quiet street, exactly the kind Michael and Serafina had always dreamed of. A home that Eleanor, through years of frugal living and smart investments, had helped them secure with a substantial down payment she'd gifted Michael from her savings. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. Serafina answered the door, her smile an artificial construct, too wide, too bright, failing to reach her eyes. Eleanor, she said, her voice unnaturally sweet. It was a deliberate shift. For years, she had begrudgingly called her mom. The sudden use of her first name was a clear signal of the new hostile dynamic she intended to establish. Eleanor offered her own tight, polite smile in return. Serafina, she stepped inside, her gaze sweeping across the pristine living room to the dining area. Michael was already seated at the large mahogany dining table, his shoulders hunched. Before him lay a stack of papers, official-looking documents that Eleanor immediately recognized as her own estate planning papers, copies of which Serafina must have somehow obtained. Serafina moved swiftly to Michael's side, her hand immediately finding his, squeezing it in a performative gesture of solidarity. They sat together, a united front, 2 against 1, ready to deliver their ultimatum. Eleanor felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. They thought they had her cornered. They had no idea who they were truly dealing with. Eleanor took a seat at the dining table directly opposite Michael and Serafina. The table, a wedding gift from her to them, felt like a silent witness to the unfolding drama. Serafina's hand remained clasped around Michael's, a visual declaration of their unified front. Her smile, still painted on, flickered with an almost predatory anticipation. Eleanor, Serafina began, her voice sickeningly sweet, a tone Eleanor knew preceded an attack. We truly appreciate everything you've done for us over the years. We really do. But your recent behavior has been putting a significant strain on our relationship and, frankly, on our family dynamic. Eleanor met Serafina's gaze, her own expression carefully neutral. Recent behavior? I'm not sure I understand what you're referring to. She feigned ignorance, allowing Serafina to lay out her carefully constructed accusations. It was a well-worn tactic, one Eleanor had come to recognize. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding his mother's eyes. He picked up a sheet of paper, clearly a typed list, and began to read, his voice flat and rehearsed. Mom, we need to discuss some boundary crossing incidents. For example, showing up unannounced. That time you returned the casserole dish, for instance, it was unexpected and made Serafina feel like you were checking up on us. Eleanor felt a surge of incredulity. The casserole dish. She had simply wanted to retrieve her Pyrex, a dish she cherished, and had seen Michael's car in the driveway, assuming they were home. It was a 2-minute exchange, yet it had been meticulously documented and reframed as an act of intrusion. Then there's the issue of questioning our parenting decisions, Michael continued, clearly struggling with the words. When you told Chloe she was so intelligent for her age, it felt like you were indirectly criticizing our methods of raising her, implying we weren't fostering her intellect enough. Eleanor nearly scoffed aloud, complimenting her granddaughter's intelligence. A genuine observation of Chloe's bright mind was now deemed a criticism. The absurdity of it was almost laughable if it weren't so deeply hurtful. Each accusation was a meticulously distorted version of an innocent interaction, twisting her into an intrusive, judgmental, and manipulative grandmother. And Mom, when you told Liam that story about me as a boy, about how I climbed the big oak tree, Serafina felt you were trying to manipulate him, to turn him against her by appealing to his sense of adventure without considering our rules. Michael's voice trailed off, his gaze still fixed on the paper, unable to meet her eyes. Telling her grandson a charming anecdote about his father's childhood, a story meant to bond them, to share a piece of family history, was now manipulation. Eleanor mentally ticked off the boxes. Each item on Michael's list was designed to portray her as a villain, a subtle saboteur. Serafina, sensing Michael's discomfort, smoothly took over, her voice hardening. And then there's the bigger issue, Eleanor. We feel you've been using your money to try and maintain control over our family, to influence our decisions. Eleanor almost choked on her carefully maintained composure. The sheer audacity. This was rich coming from Serafina, who had, on more than one occasion, specifically asked Eleanor for a little help with the mortgage when Michael's hours were cut, or when an unexpected bill arose. Eleanor had always provided quietly, without expectation, out of love for her son. To suggest she used it for control was a monstrous lie. Michael, perhaps emboldened by Serafina's renewed aggression, found his footing again. His voice, though still strained, grew more resolute. So, Mom, what we need from you is to step back, to let us be our own family, to respect our decisions without interference. Serafina leaned forward, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, as if delivering a heartbreaking confession. I love you, Eleanor, I truly do. The words were an empty vessel, devoid of any genuine emotion. Then came the ultimate blow, delivered with a practiced sorrow. But Michael and I, after much thought, we think it would be best if we took a break from regular contact, just for a while, to give us space. Eleanor felt a cold, sharp pang. This was it, the official severing, the culmination of Serafina's midnight threats, now given a formal, pseudo-caring veneer. She looked from Serafina's expectant face to Michael's downturned eyes. Her son, her only child, was allowing this to happen. He was complicit. And if I don't agree to these new terms? Eleanor asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room's tense silence. Serafina's smile faltered for a microsecond, a flash of annoyance replacing the feigned sorrow. Then we'll have to consider more permanent boundaries, Eleanor, she replied, her voice tightening. For the sake of our family's mental health, we might need to make some very difficult decisions regarding your future involvement with Chloe and Liam. It was a thinly veiled threat of total estrangement, of cutting her off from her grandchildren entirely. Eleanor knew this was Serafina's promised cutoff, just a formality to make Michael feel they had tried to work things out. It was a show for her son, a carefully staged performance to justify the inevitable. Michael, unable to meet her gaze, merely nodded along, a puppet on Serafina's strings. Eleanor took a deep breath, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment. She met Serafina's triumphant smirk, then looked at Michael, whose face was still averted, etched with shame or perhaps just discomfort. A quiet strength settled over her. This was it, her moment. "I understand," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady. Serafina's face instantly flooded with relief, a smug satisfaction replacing her strained sympathy. She thought Eleanor was capitulating, crumbling under the pressure, just as she always had. She thought she had won. But then Eleanor delivered her bombshell, her words precise and calm, shattering Serafina's fleeting triumph. "Yes, I understand completely, and I think we should make this official. Would tomorrow morning work for you both? Say 10 o'clock at my attorney's office? I think it's time we all had a truly honest conversation about family expectations and boundaries. Wouldn't you agree?" The tension was palpable, but the story is just beginning. If you're captivated by Eleanor's quiet strength, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to follow her journey as it unfolds. You won't want to miss what happens next. Serafina's triumphant smirk vanished, replaced by a sudden, stark pallor. Her jaw dropped slightly. "Your attorney?" she stammered, the words barely a whisper, laced with a fear Eleanor had never witnessed in her before. Eleanor allowed herself a small, serene smile, the very same artificial, condescending smile Serafina had perfected over the years. "Yes, Serafina," she replied, her voice calm and controlled. "Given the nature of the permanent boundaries you mentioned and the serious accusations made, I think it's only prudent to have proper documentation. Wouldn't you agree, for everyone's clarity?" She rose from the table, gathering her purse. Michael still sat motionless, his face a mask of confusion. But Serafina was already on her feet, her eyes wide with dawning panic. Eleanor left them there, a sudden, urgent flurry of whispers erupting behind her as she walked out. Serafina's voice, usually so composed, now had a frantic edge, rising in worried questions to Michael. "Sued? What's she suing us for? What has she done?" The drive home, usually a familiar route filled with quiet melancholy, now felt exhilarating. The burden that had weighed on Eleanor for years had lifted, replaced by a strange lightness. She was no longer the broken, discarded grandmother, the silent victim. She was a woman with a plan, a meticulously crafted strategy to reclaim her life and her dignity. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce determination. The law office of Helen Miller was situated in a sleek, modern building downtown, all polished marble and hushed tones. It was precisely the kind of imposing, prestigious environment Eleanor had chosen to subtly intimidate Serafina, who reveled in appearances. Helen Miller herself was formidable, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for specializing in complex family law cases. Eleanor had confided in her everything, laying bare the years of emotional abuse, the calculated alienation, the desperate hope that her son would eventually see the truth. As Eleanor reviewed her meticulously organized documentation with Helen that morning, the lawyer had looked at her with a gentle, understanding gaze. "You are truly ready for this, Mrs. Holloway?" Helen had asked, her voice calm. Eleanor had met her gaze steadily. "The way things were was slowly killing me, Helen," she'd confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't live like that anymore. And if Michael chooses to believe her lies after all this, at least this way, he'll know the truth. It will be out in the open." Helen had simply nodded, her expression conveying quiet approval. At precisely 10 a.m. the next morning, Michael and Serafina arrived. They were dressed up, Serafina in a sharp business suit, Michael in an uncharacteristically formal tie. Their nervousness was palpable. Serafina's usual confident stride was hesitant, her eyes darting around the reception area, clearly unnerved by the formal atmosphere. Michael looked pale, his face a mixture of apprehension and bewildered concern. Helen Miller, ever composed, greeted them with a polite, professional smile and led them into the conference room. She ushered Eleanor to a seat opposite a large polished table, then indicated for Michael and Serafina to sit on the same side. The arrangement immediately set a tone of confrontation, 2 against 1, though this time, Eleanor felt entirely in control. "Good morning, Mrs. Holloway," Helen began, deliberately addressing Eleanor by her formal married name. a subtle but effective way to establish the professional nature of the meeting, further distancing Eleanor from the familial role Serafina had tried to erase. And Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, thank you for coming. Helen's voice was calm, professional, devoid of any emotional inflection. This meeting has been called to discuss the legal implications of the boundaries that have been discussed, particularly regarding Mrs. Holloway's access to her grandchildren, Chloe and Liam, and her relationship with her son, Michael. Michael looked utterly confused. Legal implications? Helen, what exactly is going on? We just came to discuss family issues. His gaze flickered to Serafina, who was no longer looking at him but rather scanning the room, her eyes wide, recognizing that this was entirely outside her carefully controlled domestic sphere. She was in unfamiliar territory where her usual manipulations held no sway. Helen offered a small, polite smile. Indeed, Mr. Holloway, and sometimes family issues have legal dimensions. Now, to ensure we have a full and transparent understanding of the situation, Mrs. Holloway has provided some documentation. With your permission, I'd like to share some relevant excerpts. Before either Michael or Serafina could object, Helen opened the first folder on the table. It was labeled in crisp typescript, Evidence of Parental Alienation Audio Transcripts. She put on a pair of elegant reading glasses and began to read, her voice clear and steady, devoid of judgment, simply presenting the facts. This is a transcript from a recording dated 18 months after wedding. The speaker, identified as Serafina Holloway, states, "Honestly, Michael, your mother is just so needy. She calls twice a week, darling. Twice. It's just too much. I feel like she's hovering, constantly needing attention." Serafina's face drained of color. The blood seemed to rush from her cheeks, leaving her pale and visibly shaken. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She heard her own voice, her own calculated words echoing in the sterile room. Helen continued, moving through the transcripts with relentless precision. And this, from date 6 months later. Michael, we really need to set some boundaries with your mother. She just showed up today with a book for Chloe, without even asking. It's undermining my authority as a mother. Serafina's eyes darted between Eleanor, who remained impassive, and Helen, who continued to read. The room was utterly silent, save for Helen's calm voice. Serafina heard herself, unfiltered and unedited, calling Eleanor controlling, needy, awkward, and cheap. She heard her own discussions with her mother about limiting contact and prioritizing our immediate family. She heard the cold, calculating strategies to limit access to the grandchildren, to paint Eleanor as a burden. Helen paused, looking up briefly. For clarity, it is perfectly legal to record conversations in public spaces or in one's own vicinity within the bounds of a single-party consent state, which ours is. These recordings were made primarily in Mrs. Holloway's home or during situations where the speaker had no reasonable expectation of privacy regarding their words. Michael, who had been sitting in stunned silence, his gaze fixed on his wife's horrified face, slowly turned to look at his mother. The confusion on his face was giving way to a dawning, terrible realization. He heard his wife's voice, casual and cruel, describing his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, as a tiresome burden. The truth, meticulously preserved and now unveiled, began to unfold before him. The calm, professional voice of Helen Miller continued to echo Serafina's own words through the conference room, each transcript a brutal exposé of her deceit. Michael, who had been listening with growing horror, finally broke his stunned silence. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice hoarse, a tremor of disbelief in his tone. "Is this true? Did you really say these things?" He looked at her, his eyes wide with a dawning realization that shattered years of unquestioning trust. Serafina, caught completely off guard, quickly shifted tactics. Her face crumpled, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, summoning immediate, manufactured tears. "Michael, darling, it's not what it sounds like," she sobbed, her voice trembling. "I was just venting. You know how much pressure I've been under with work and the kids. I never meant any of it." She shot a venomous glare at Eleanor, as if her raw, ugly words were Eleanor's fault for documenting them. Helen Miller, however, was unmoved by the theatrical display. She simply raised a perfectly manicured hand. Mrs. Holloway, she interjected, her voice firm, cutting through Serafina's histrionics. Venting is one thing. Systematic campaigns of alienation, deliberate misrepresentation of a loved one, and calculated efforts to destroy a family bond are another entirely. These recordings show a clear pattern, not an isolated incident. Helen then opened another folder, revealing a series of screenshots. These were text messages and emails, laid out with damning clarity. They showed Serafina instructing Michael on what to tell Eleanor, coaching him on how to subtly distance himself, even dictating responses he should give when Eleanor called. Michael's face turned a deeper shade of pale as he saw his own words. Words he'd believed were his own, revealed to be Serafina's script. The next folder Helen opened contained the financial documentation. As she began to itemize the figures, the room fell into a fresh, stunned silence. From Mrs. Holloway's meticulous records, we have documentation of $28,000 in direct mortgage assistance to you both over several years. Another $15,000 contributed for childcare expenses, particularly when Mrs. Holloway returned to work after Liam's birth, and a conservative estimate of $12,000 in various supplies, gifts, and educational materials for the children, not including the substantial down payment Mrs. Holloway provided for this very house, nor her significant contributions to your wedding expenses. Michael gasped, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He stared at the documents, his eyes scanning the columns of figures. "Mom, I had no idea it was that much," he stammered, his voice filled with genuine shock. Serafina always said you'd only help with a few thousand here and there, when we were really struggling. She told me not to worry about it." He looked at Serafina, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing betrayal. The few thousand was a lie, a vast understatement that painted Eleanor's immense generosity as trivial. Serafina, her manufactured tears momentarily forgotten, watched Michael's reaction, a flicker of panic in her eyes. But the worst was yet to come. Helen revealed the final folder, its contents sending a chill through the already tense room. "And finally," she said, her voice now carrying a sharper edge, "we have this. Documentation of Mrs. Serafina Holloway researching Mrs. Eleanor Holloway's personal assets, contacting Mrs. Holloway's bank with false claims, attempting to access information, and even, quite recently, attempting to obtain details of Mrs. Holloway's will with the expressed intention of contesting it." The room went utterly silent. Serafina's tears ceased altogether. The performance dropped, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Her eyes, no longer brimming with fake sorrow, narrowed dangerously. This was no longer about hurt feelings or misunderstandings. This was about money. "You recorded me," Serafina hissed, her voice low and venomous, her gaze fixed on Eleanor. "You've been spying on your own family. This is an invasion of privacy." Eleanor met her gaze without flinching. Her voice, calm and steady, filled the suddenly charged silence. "I documented a pattern of emotional abuse, parental alienation, and financial manipulation, Serafina. A pattern that clearly intended to systematically remove me from my son's life and from my grandchildren's. Which brings us to why we are here today." Helen Miller took over, cutting off any further protest from Serafina. "Mrs. Holloway has come to us with a clear resolution. Firstly, all financial support to you both, Michael and Serafina, ceases immediately and permanently. There will be no further mortgage assistance, childcare contributions, or any other monetary gifts from this point forward." Michael slumped in his chair, the weight of this announcement clearly hitting him hard. Serafina's jaw tightened. "Secondly," Helen continued, "Mrs. Holloway is prepared to forego pursuing legal action for emotional distress, harassment, and defamation, provided certain conditions are met." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Condition 1, a public correction of all the lies and misrepresentations that have been spread about Mrs. Eleanor Holloway. This includes a full, truthful explanation to all family members, friends, and mutual acquaintances who have been influenced by Serafina's narrative." Serafina scoffed. "That's humiliating. You can't ask me to do that." Helen's smile was thin, almost predatory. "Not as humiliating, Mrs. Holloway, as having these recordings, every single one of them, with full transcripts, played for the entire extended family, or presented as evidence in open court. This is a choice, not a demand. Condition 2, Helen pressed on, is the immediate restoration of Mrs. Holloway's visitation and contact with her grandchildren, Chloe and Liam, to the pre-alienation schedule. No gatekeeping, no restrictions, and no further attempts to poison their minds against their grandmother. Michael finally looked up, meeting Eleanor's eyes. His expression was a complex mix of shame, regret, and a dawning understanding. Serafina, however, was fuming, her face contorted in a silent battle between rage and fear. If these conditions are not agreed to, Helen concluded, her voice unwavering, Mrs. Holloway will pursue all available legal remedies. This includes seeking restraining orders to prevent further harassment, filing a lawsuit for the repayment of all undocumented financial support, which will likely exceed $250,000, and most importantly, utilizing this extensive documentation of parental alienation to seek judicial intervention regarding the grandchildren's custody and welfare, ensuring they have healthy, unfettered access to their grandmother. The threat hung heavy in the air, cold and undeniable. Eleanor, watching Serafina's face, knew she had been cornered. The silence in Helen Miller's office was deafening, punctuated only by the subtle hum of the air conditioning. Serafina's face was a mask of furious indignation. Finally, she broke the quiet, her voice tight with suppressed rage. "This is a blackmail," she spat, her eyes flashing between Eleanor and Helen. "You're trying to blackmail us." Eleanor met her gaze, unwavering. "No, Serafina," she stated calmly, her voice resonant with a quiet power. "Blackmail is what you did to me last night, with your threats to erase me from my grandchildren's lives. This," she gestured around the room, encompassing the folders of evidence in Helen's stern presence, "this is consequences." Michael, who had been staring at the polished conference table as if it held all the answers, slowly lifted his head. His eyes, when they met Eleanor's, were filled with a profound mixture of shame, grief, and a raw, agonizing regret. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought I believed." His words trailed off, choked with emotion. The reality of his wife's calculated deception, laid bare by the cold, hard evidence, had finally shattered his illusions. Eleanor's gaze softened, a flicker of the love she had always held for him shining through her resolve. "You believed the woman you loved, Michael," she said gently, her voice devoid of accusation. "She was very good at what she did, but now you know the truth." Helen Miller, ever the professional, interjected to regain control of the meeting. "I'll need an answer from you both by Friday," she stated, her voice brisk. "These conditions are non-negotiable. If we don't receive your signed agreement by then, Mrs. Holloway will proceed with legal action as outlined." Serafina, her face still contorted with impotent fury, shot one last desperate threat at Eleanor. "You'll regret this, Eleanor. You'll lose your son forever. You'll never get him back after this." Eleanor looked at her, a faint, sad smile gracing her lips. "I lost my son the day he married you, Serafina," she replied softly, her words piercing the air with their quiet truth. "But maybe," she added, her gaze briefly meeting Michael's distraught eyes, "maybe now I can find him again." With that, Eleanor rose, collected her belongings, and walked out, leaving Michael and Serafina alone with the weight of the undeniable truth. Michael called Eleanor on Thursday evening, his voice hesitant, almost pleading. "Mom, can I come over alone?" "Of course, Michael," Eleanor replied, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "The door's open." He arrived 20 minutes later, looking utterly disheveled, his clothes rumpled, his hair a mess. His eyes were red-rimmed, and his face was drawn, etched with genuine distress. He looked like the boy she used to comfort, not the distant man he had become. He didn't even make it to the living room before he started talking, his words tumbling out in a torrent of regret and self-recrimination. "Mom, I am so sorry," he choked out, collapsing onto a kitchen chair. "I was so stupid, so incredibly stupid. I let her play me for a fool." He buried his face in his hands, shuddering. Eleanor placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You weren't stupid, Michael," she said softly, her voice filled with understanding. "You were in love with someone who was very, very good at manipulation. She made you believe what she wanted you to believe. Michael lifted his head, his eyes brimming with tears. After we left the lawyer's office, I went numb. Serafina started screaming at me, accusing you of spying. But then something shifted. I started looking at things, really looking. He pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through it. Look at this, Mom. He held out the phone, displaying a text message. It was from Serafina to her sister. The message read, "Just got Eleanor to come over. Told Michael she thought the dollhouse was a waste of money and Chloe should be playing outside more. He's totally buying it. Made her look like the problem again." Eleanor felt a fresh wave of nausea, the dollhouse. She had bought Chloe a beautiful, handcrafted dollhouse for her birthday, a gift she knew her granddaughter would adore. Serafina had twisted that act of love into a criticism, a judgment on her parenting. "That's just one," Michael continued, scrolling frantically. "There are dozens, Mom, dozens of texts. She would plan it after every single interaction with you. Tell Mom you're busy. Remind her we have our own plans. Spin it like she was trying to start an argument." He showed her screen after screen, a chilling timeline of Serafina's calculated deceit, designed to isolate Eleanor, to make her appear intrusive and difficult. Michael hung his head. And I believed her. Every time, I defended her to others, made excuses for why you weren't at family events, why you weren't calling as often. I told myself you were just difficult, that you didn't understand modern parenting. He looked at her, his face a mask of profound shame. "I made you a villain in my own mind, Mom, and it was all her." He then revealed Serafina's desperate attempts to mitigate the damage after the lawyer's meeting. "She tried to convince me you'd manipulated the recordings, Mom. Used AI, edited them to make her look bad. When that didn't work, she started yelling that you'd violated our privacy, that you'd been spying on us. But then something clicked," Michael continued, his voice heavy with self-loathing. "I remember you always used to call on Sunday mornings just to chat. After Chloe was born, those calls just stopped. Serafina always said you were too busy or had plans. But yesterday, after I started questioning everything, I looked through her phone records. She intercepted every single one of your Sunday calls, Mom. Every one. And then she deleted the call logs." Eleanor felt a cold knot in her stomach. The Sunday calls, a cherished tradition, stolen from her, replaced with a lie. The depth of Serafina's depravity, her relentless, systematic campaign to erase her, was truly astounding. But looking at Michael's distraught face, seeing the genuine remorse and raw pain, Eleanor also felt a fragile flicker of hope. Her son, her real son, was finally starting to see. Michael's confession continued into the late hours, each revelation another gut punch. "The worst part, Mom," he choked out, his voice thick with anguish, "is what she did to Chloe and Liam. She poisoned them against you, against me too, by making me believe those lies." He recounted how, just weeks ago, Liam had quietly asked him, "Daddy, why does Grandma Eleanor never come to my school events like other grandmas?" The innocent question, devoid of malice, had now taken on a terrifying new significance, a stark contradiction to Serafina's constant claims that Eleanor was too busy or just didn't care for noisy school functions. Then came the truly horrifying disclosure. Michael had returned home after their meeting with Helen, confronting Serafina with the evidence. In her furious denial, she had thrown a lamp at him, shouting accusations. In the ensuing chaos, he had stumbled upon a small, leather-bound diary hidden in her bedside table. Its contents laid bare the full extent of her evil. "She had a 2-year plan, Mom," Michael whispered, his voice trembling. "A detailed plan to push you out of my life completely, to ensure she'd inherit everything. She called it Operation Golden Years, a sick joke." The diary chronicled Serafina's meticulous research into elder abuse laws, not to prevent it, but to exploit it. She had been actively seeking ways to prove Eleanor mentally incompetent, documenting minor forgetfulness or confusion as signs of decline. Michael's eyes widened with fresh horror. "She even contacted Adult Protective Services, Mom, with anonymous false reports about your living conditions and mental state, trying to trigger an investigation." Eleanor felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The routine check by a social worker last year, dismissed as a random welfare visit, now made horrifying sense. It was Serafina's doing, a calculated step in her plan. And then, Michael said, his voice dropping to a stunned whisper, there was the house, our house. He looked around Eleanor's cozy living room, then back at her. Mom, you own our house, not the bank. You bought it outright and set up a fake mortgage for us to pay you back without us ever knowing you were the actual owner. Eleanor nodded, a quiet affirmation. She had wanted to secure their future, to provide them with a home free from the whims of banks, without Michael feeling like a charity case. It was a silent gift, a safety net. Serafina found out 6 months ago, Michael continued, the words tumbling out. She was trying to refinance, to take out more equity, and the bank informed her the mortgage was private. She saw the documents. That's when her plans escalated. She intended to use the elder abuse claims to have you declared incompetent, then legally challenge your ownership, claiming it was a manipulation on your part, and gain full control of the property. A quiet gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. This was a depth of betrayal she hadn't even imagined. Serafina hadn't just wanted her out, she had wanted her wealth and her home. Eleanor then took a deep breath. It was time for Michael to understand the full scope of Serafina's miscalculation. Michael, she began, that house isn't the only property I own. I also own the rental property where Serafina's sister lives, and the apartment building her parents rent their unit from, and the commercial space where her father runs his business. Michael stared at her, his jaw dropping. Oh, God, he whispered, his face draining of color. She's going to lose everything. Eleanor shook her head. I won't make anyone homeless, Michael. That's not who I am. But I also won't subsidize the very people who have been actively trying to destroy me and alienate me from my own family. They'll simply start paying fair market value directly to me starting next month. Faced with the full, devastating truth of Serafina's betrayal, Michael looked utterly lost. What happens now, Mom? He asked, his voice small, like a child's. Eleanor reached out, taking his hand. My door is always open, Michael, always. The next morning, Friday, Michael arrived at Helen Miller's office alone. He looked different. His wedding ring was conspicuously absent from his left hand, and he carried a small suitcase. His face was still drawn, but there was a new resolve in his eyes. Serafina isn't coming, he stated, his voice flat, and she's not agreeing to your terms. She threw a lamp at me last night when I told her I couldn't live like this anymore. She threatened to keep the children from me, too. His eyes held a flicker of pain. She already took Chloe and Liam to her parents, claiming I was having a mental health crisis because I was questioning her. He then showed them his phone. Serafina had already launched her own social media campaign, painting Eleanor as a toxic, manipulative mother-in-law, using carefully crafted half-truths to garner sympathy. This, however, only solidified Michael's decision. I've seen enough, Mom. I can't live like this. I can fight for custody myself, with your help. Over the next 6 grueling months, Eleanor rarely saw Chloe and Liam. The few times she did, their interactions were strained. They were clearly coached. Grandma Eleanor, Chloe had once asked, her young eyes wide with suspicion, did you really try to steal our house? Liam, however, oblivious to the deeper family machinations, had simply looked up at her and said, Grandma, do you remember those dinosaur pancakes you used to make? A tiny spark of hope. In the custody proceedings, Helen Miller presented Eleanor's meticulous evidence. The audio recordings, the text messages, the financial records, the diary entries, all laid out with irrefutable clarity. The judge was visibly stunned. Michael's heartfelt, candid testimony, admitting his own blindness and explaining how he had been systematically manipulated, sealed the case. The judge awarded Michael primary custody of Chloe and Liam. Serafina was granted only supervised visitation until she underwent extensive counseling to address her manipulative behaviors. Furthermore, any contact with Eleanor was strictly prohibited until she demonstrated significant behavioral changes, a stipulation Eleanor knew would likely mean never. True to her word, Eleanor quietly transferred ownership of the rental property, the apartment building, and the commercial space to Serafina's family at fair market value, ensuring they were no longer financially beholden to her. Serafina's public social media campaign backfired spectacularly as the court documents detailing her calculated deceit and parental alienation became public record. 6 months after the judgment, Chloe and Liam spent their first unsupervised weekend with Eleanor. They ran into her arms, their faces beaming. "Grandma," Chloe exclaimed, "can you make dinosaur pancakes?" Liam, clutching a worn teddy bear, added, "And can we play with the dollhouse?" Later that evening, Michael arrived to pick them up, looking relaxed, genuinely happy, a shadow lifted from his shoulders. He watched his children laugh with their grandmother, a sight he hadn't thought possible a year ago. Eleanor sat between her son and her grandchildren, the warmth of their presence filling the once empty space in her heart. She knew then, and with absolute certainty, that it was worth every difficult moment. Serafina, disgraced and financially crippled, moved across the country, making no effort to rebuild relationships with anyone, including her own parents, who had cut her off for her manipulative behavior and attempts to leverage their properties against Eleanor. Michael squeezed Eleanor's hand, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for fighting for us when we were too blind to fight for ourselves."